What if the British crown wasn't just built on duty, bloodlines, and empire, but also on morphine, laudanum, ether, and poppy syrup? Behind the portraits and pageantry lies a pharmacological history no one talks about. 33 royals, high as the throne they sat on, medicated into monarchy. This isn't a tabloid exposé. It's the true clinical royal tradition, ruling with one hand on the scepter and the other on the bottle. Welcome to the House of Windsor and opium. This is 33 British royals who were high all the time. Before we dive straight into the velvet-draped haze of royal narcotics, make sure you hit subscribe, especially if morally ambiguous history and chemically altered monarchs are your thing. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it over there? Midnight in Manchester? Dawn in Delhi? We want to know who's staying up with us in the Laudanum Lounge. 1. George IV. By the time George IV became king, he was already halfway embalmed, not in the literal mummified sense, but in the soft, humming cloud of laudanum, opium pills, and the ever-loyal clutch of narcotic tinctures that never left his side. This was a man who didn't walk into a room. He sweated his way in, powdered and perfumed to within an inch of collapse. His body was a palace of contradictions, regal and rotting, pampered and pained, and always, always in search of a stronger dose. George, back when he was just the Prince Regent, had been a royal spectacle, lavish, theatrical, addicted to appearances as much as he was to drugs. But his drug use wasn't simply recreational. It was strategic, even existential. He was riddled with gout, bloated to the brink of caricature, and plagued by what his doctors called nervous agonies. The prescriptions? Opiate-heavy tinctures, nightly drafts of laudanum, and concoctions so viscous with sedatives they could have put down a cavalry horse. Physicians of the time rarely said no to a royal. So when George IV requested stronger mixtures for his melancholy fits and nerve storms, he got them. The line between pain management and chemical indulgence blurred quickly, particularly when you're the monarch and your medicine chest is larger than most apothecaries'. He didn't merely take laudanum, he relied on it, clutched it, scheduled around it. The dosage crept upward with each passing year. Courtiers whispered of his hours locked in bedchambers, his trembling hands, the way he'd become almost amphibian under the skin, damp, sluggish, swollen. One ambassador noted with dry alarm that His Majesty seemed less a man than a specter of his former excess. But opium has a funny way of making the unbearable feel divine. For George, the narcotics offered a warped kind of freedom, from royal obligations, from the grotesque theater of politics, from his own collapsing health. Every golden bottle on his bedside table was a passport to peace, and every morning after was a small death. He self-medicated through diplomatic crises, public scandals, and his own mounting irrelevance. By the end, his body was barely functioning, ballooned with fluids, organs overworked and underlubricated, and yet he clung to his medicine. The thing meant to dull pain had become its own disease. Historians often call George IV the first modern monarch, but rarely with admiration. He was the king who turned the throne into a chaise longue, ruled the empire from behind a curtain of opium vapor, and built Brighton Pavilion while high enough to mistake Indo-Saracenic architecture for modest beach decor. Still, it would be easy to laugh him off as a punchline, England's opiated dandy in a gold-trimmed dressing gown. But look closer. You'll see a man who didn't want to be king, who medicated his way through trauma, who suffered in full public view with no privacy and no plan. In a court, in a palaiki, where decorum was everything, drugs were his only escape. And he wasn't the only royal using that exit. Because as George IV descended deeper into his velvet-lined fog, a young woman was beginning her own chemical relationship with the crown, one that would last far longer and be remembered with far more affection. Her name was Victoria. 2. Queen Victoria. She is remembered as the embodiment of restraint, the iron-boned matriarch of an empire on which the sun never set. And yet Queen Victoria's composure was more pharmaceutical than divine. Her authority was global, her grief was legendary, and her medicine cabinet was unusually well-stocked. Victoria, the forever mourning widow in black, had a secret. Well, not so secret if you read between the lines of her diaries or the prescriptions of her court physicians. This was a woman who relied on laudanum not just for physical pain, but for emotional maintenance. An analgesic empress in every sense. What made it fascinating was how unremarkable this was considered at the time. Laudanum, an opium-based tincture mixed with alcohol, was as ordinary in the Victorian household as soap. Only, Victoria didn't just dabble. She used it regularly for menstrual cramps, pain which she described in letters as interfering with all gladness. She was prescribed morphia derivatives after childbirth, especially following the difficult deliveries of her 9 children. And yes, her physicians also gave her cannabis tinctures, often recommended to young mothers for postpartum recovery. All of this endorsed by the royal court's top medical minds. Science, they called it. Self-medication, in hindsight. To her contemporaries, this was simply part of the female condition. A queen's suffering had to be silent, palatable, and preferably soaked in alcohol. Victorian medicine loved its euphemisms, nervous troubles, female maladies, delicate constitutions. But the solutions were consistently chemical. And when the burden of running an empire landed atop the private grief of losing a husband, Victoria leaned harder into her prescriptions. What she took to soften her womb, she soon took to soften the world. Her correspondence becomes telling in the years after Albert's death. There are long periods of lethargy, spiritual numbness, and an odd kind of calm detachment. Not quite depression, not quite lucidity, something between mourning and medicated survival. She referred to her tinctures as little helps, which might sound quaint until you realize she was functionally dependent on narcotics during some of the most pivotal years of her reign. The paradox is rich. A queen who stood for morality, domestic virtue, and imperial pride, yet floated through many of her ceremonial duties under the influence of drugs no less potent than anything found in modern rehab clinics. And still, she ruled. Through wars, rebellions, and scandals. She held the empire together not in spite of the medicine, but perhaps because of it. That's the thing about Victoria. She didn't appear to be an addict, so no one called her one. She remained poised, stoic, distant. And in doing so, she gave generations of women the impossible standard of graceful suffering. But behind that cold-eyed portrait was a woman chemically sedated against the roaring pressure of monarchy, motherhood, and mourning. The drugs didn't ruin her image, they helped maintain it. And she wasn't the only one in the family. One of her sons would follow her example. Though his pain was physical, his prescription was stronger, and his end far darker. Prince Leopold never had a chance. If you're still with us after Queen Victoria's cannabis tinctures and Prince Leopold's morphine mornings, you might just belong here. Go ahead and subscribe. We dig into the side of history they don't teach in school. And tell us in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Are you wide awake in Winnipeg or half asleep in Johannesburg? We're building a timeline of insomniacs and curious minds. 3. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. If Queen Victoria embodied the stoic medicated endurance of the empire, her son Prince Leopold wore the crown of hereditary fragility. And he wore it with quiet defiance, and a bottle of morphine within reach. Leopold was the 8th child and the youngest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. He was born into privilege, but also into pain. From the beginning, his life was overshadowed by a condition that Victorian physicians barely understood, but treated with a predictable blend of pity and poppies: hemophilia. The so-called royal disease left his blood unable to clot properly, meaning the smallest injury could spiral into something dangerous, even fatal. In Leopold's case, it meant a life of bruises, internal bleeding, and, eventually, constant chronic pain. and with chronic pain came medicine. In 19th century Britain, that almost always meant opium in some form. For Leopold, it meant morphine. From an early age, he was under near constant care. The palace was modified for his safety. Courtiers were instructed to report every stumble. Even Victoria herself, who wasn't known for maternal softness, watched him with an anxious intensity that bordered on superstition. She referred to him as her poor boy well into his adulthood. Behind closed doors, she wept over his pain and fretted over his delicate constitution. But no amount of royal worry could dull the agony in Leopold's joints, his muscles, his bones. Morphine could. It started as medical necessity. The doctors prescribed it cautiously at first, tiny, carefully measured doses. But as his condition worsened, so did the prescriptions. Eventually, he relied on it daily. He carried it with him. He slept beside it. He consulted his physicians constantly, not to ask whether he should take more, but when. This wasn't abuse in the scandalous modern sense. This was survival. And yet, as his tolerance grew, so did his dependency. The more pain he felt, the more morphine he needed. The more he took, the more detached he became, from court life, from public duties, even from his family. But Leopold was not a recluse, far from it. He had a brilliant mind, a biting wit, and a fierce desire to contribute to public life. He was an advocate for the arts, an early supporter of university reform, and one of the more intellectually engaged royals of his generation. His letters reveal a man desperate not to be defined by illness, but always conscious that he was. The morphine helped him function, helped him think, helped him walk into rooms with something resembling dignity, but it also numbed him, slowed him, made him, in the eyes of some relatives, unsteady. He married late and briefly, his health always a looming threat. In 1884, at age 30, he died after a fall triggered internal bleeding. Officially, the morphine wasn't blamed, but unofficially, it was understood. Without it, he couldn't move. With it, he couldn't always feel the damage. Victoria was devastated. Another child lost. Another reason to reach for the little helps. But the pattern didn't end there. One daughter after another would find themselves battling the same silent enemies: grief, pressure, illness, and the endless promise of liquid peace. Next was Victoria's namesake, and she had headaches no crown could cure. 4. Princess Victoria, daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. History remembers her as the Empress of Germany, a politically ambitious royal caught between empires, ideologies, and one very difficult son. But before she ever became Empress Friedrich, Princess Victoria of the United Kingdom, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, was a woman burdened by more than dynastic duties. She was besieged by the quiet, relentless torment of chronic migraines, female maladies, and emotional exhaustion. And like so many in her family, she treated it all with a medicine chest soaked in opium. Known within the family as Vicky, the princess was a brilliant, sharp-tongued intellectual, heavily influenced by her liberal-minded father, Prince Albert. She was fluent in multiple languages, passionate about education and science, and determined to marry not just well, but wisely. In 1858 she wed Prince Friedrich of Prussia, a promising match that placed her at the heart of the Prussian court and in the direct line of future German power. But power, as it turns out, came at a price. And in Vicky's case, that price was pain. By her mid-20s, she suffered frequent and debilitating migraines. The symptoms came on without warning: light sensitivity, nausea, throbbing pain behind the eyes, and were made worse by the intense pressure of her political environment. The Prussian court was stiff, militaristic, and profoundly conservative. Vicky, with her British liberal ideals and strong opinions, was seen as something between an outsider and a threat. Her in-laws criticized her accent, her politics, her influence over her husband. She was never quite accepted, and she never quite stopped trying. To manage both the physical and emotional toll, Vicky turned, like so many royals of her era, to laudanum. A mixture of opium and alcohol, laudanum was the go-to prescription for everything from headaches to heartbreak. And Vicky took it regularly. Letters between her and her mother are filled with euphemisms like the drops and my medicine, polite 19th century shorthand for narcotics that blurred the line between relief and routine. Her dependence wasn't unusual for the time, but it was persistent. During her pregnancies, during periods of political stress, and especially after the death of her beloved husband in 1888, just 99 days after he became German emperor, Vicky relied on opiates to manage her grief and physical strain. She had lost not only her partner, but her political future. Her son, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, distrusted her influence and pushed her aside. By the 1890s, she was living in relative isolation, her political hopes extinguished, her body worn down by chronic pain and repeated illness. She still corresponded with her British family, still engaged with intellectuals, but the tone of her letters had changed. There was a slowness in her sentences, a numbed reflection that suggested the drugs were no longer occasional comforts, but daily companions. What's striking is how quietly this all played out. Vicky wasn't scandalous, she wasn't erratic. She was by all accounts composed, dutiful, tragic. But behind the veil of Victorian propriety, she was drifting, medicated into silence, softened around the edges, erased a little more with each tincture, and yet even her story seems almost serene compared to the one that followed, because her sister, Princess Alice, did not go quietly. She burned, she broke, and she bled for her ideals. And through it all, she took her medicine. 5. Princess Alice of the United Kingdom. Princess Alice was not built for palace walls. She was too sincere, too raw, too prone to inconvenient emotions. The third child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, she inherited her father's sense of duty and her mother's inner melancholia. But unlike either of them, she lacked the ability to conceal it. Life bruised Alice easily, and in return, she built a strange intimacy with pain, treating it not as an enemy, but as a fact of existence. It wasn't long before that intimacy turned chemical. Alice married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and moved to the small German duchy where court life was threadbare compared to Windsor. She adapted, of course, royals always do. But the adjustment was not without cost. She gave birth to 7 children in 13 years, 3 of them during times of war and financial strain. The pregnancies were physically brutal. The recoveries were worse. And the medicine? Laudanum, opium laced with alcohol, was prescribed for nearly all of it. Labor pain, postpartum cramping, insomnia, the nervous disorders of royal womanhood. Over time, those prescriptions grew into something more habitual. By the early 1870s, Alice was known in her circle for her charity work, especially with the sick and dying. She volunteered in hospitals, comforted wounded soldiers, and famously nursed her own children through outbreaks of diphtheria. Her capacity for care was immense. But so was her suffering. She began complaining regularly of neuralgia, headaches, deep fatigue, and what she called persistent anxieties. For those ailments, laudanum remained her go-to remedy, taken quietly, routinely, and in increasing quantities. The opiates dulled the sharp edges of her grief, because grief was the ever-returning guest in her life. Her 4th child, a boy named Friedrich, was born with hemophilia, just like her brother Leopold. At age 2, he died after a minor fall. Alice never fully recovered. Letters from this period reveal a woman spiraling inward, withdrawing from the social rituals of royal life. She stopped attending balls. She wrote dark reflections about God and suffering. She clung to her remaining children with a fear that bordered on panic. Still, she did not crumble. Not publicly. She continued her duties, kept up correspondence with her family in Britain, and maintained a well-organized household. But beneath the surface, she was increasingly propped up by medicated rest, a euphemism that appears with unnerving regularity in her doctor's records. It was the Victorian solution to everything. When the body ached, when the heart broke, when the mind wandered too far into sadness, there was always the bottle with the unmarked dose. Alice's health collapsed completely in 1878 during a diphtheria outbreak that swept through her household. Already physically weakened, she caught the infection herself after caring for her sick children. She died on December 14th, coincidentally the anniversary of her father's death. She was 35. There is no scandal in Alice's story. No lurid rumors, no tabloid-worthy breakdowns. Just a woman undone by duty, motherhood, and the limits of 19th century medicine. Her drug use was not rebellion, it was resignation. But not every royal treated their prescriptions so solemnly. Alice's brother, Edward, the future King Edward VII, had a rather different relationship with laudanum, ether, and a few friends known simply as anesthetics. His parties were legendary. His pain, optional. His prescriptions, recreational. 6. Edward VII, as Prince of Wales. Before he was the rotund, cigar-puffing King Edward VII, he was Bertie, a nickname too casual for the weight of his title, and far too gentle for the kind of life he led. Bertie didn't want the crown. Not really. What he wanted was pleasure, and in Victorian England, that was practically a crime. But being a prince came with one undeniable perk: access to everything. And that included a dazzling range of early anesthetics, opium elixirs, and whatever chemical was trending in the upper echelons of medicine and indulgence. Edward's drug use never earned the moral panic that surrounded modern addictions. He wasn't found collapsed in corridors or muttering incoherently on balconies. No, Bertie was too polished for that. His indulgence came cloaked in aristocratic routine, medical necessity, of course. After all, this was a man frequently afflicted with bronchial troubles, bouts of exhaustion, and the kind of vague royal ailments that always seem to arrive conveniently before banquets, after scandals, or during high-stakes diplomatic functions. His prescription: laudanum, chloroform, ether, depending on the decade. The line between treatment and recreation was hazy, and Edward walked it with champagne in one hand and a pharmacist's curiosity in the other. Reports from his younger years speak of chloroform parties, experimental evenings hosted by physicians and aristocrats curious about the effects of inhaled anesthetics. These were medical demonstrations dressed up as salon entertainment. Everyone was invited to take a whiff. Everyone laughed. Some passed out. Others woke up raving about visions and sensations. And Bertie? He came back for more. He reportedly took laudanum for persistent throat issues and recurring chest infections. In the 19th century, this was standard practice. Laudanum could be bought in every pharmacy, but Edward didn't buy it. He was given the best. His physicians prescribed it liberally, particularly after hunting accidents or long evenings at the gambling tables when his nerves refused to settle. Laudanum was how the elite managed discomfort. Bertie simply managed more of it than most. He was also no stranger to morphine injections during his later years, especially after bouts of severe gout and inflammation began to limit his mobility. These, too, were considered medical necessities. But the frequency raised eyebrows. His weight ballooned, his skin changed. He often appeared glassy-eyed during court functions. Friends noted he had moods, and while much was blamed on his temperament, a quieter truth followed him. Edward was always either medicating or recovering from it. Yet he functioned. He thrived, even. He charmed world leaders, seduced opera singers, and navigated scandal after scandal with the graceful, drowsy composure of a man who knew something stronger than diplomacy could always be arranged. His reign was brief but popular, and his legacy, oddly, remained largely untarnished. Perhaps it was because Edward never claimed to be virtuous. He just wanted to feel good, or, at the very least, feel less. But his pleasures masked something deeper, something passed down from his mother and shared by his siblings. because just as Edward floated through his ailments with narcotic help, his son would carry the same fragile lungs, the same constitution, and the same affinity for soft, numbing sleep. Enter Prince Albert Victor, the next in line for both the crown and the medicine. 7. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. Prince Albert Victor, nicknamed Eddie by his family, was the kind of royal who seemed destined to be remembered vaguely. The grandson of Queen Victoria, the eldest son of Edward VII, and second in line to the British throne, he had the pedigree of a future king and the constitution of a ghost. Pale, slow, and often withdrawn, Albert Victor moved through the royal timeline like a figure in soft focus, always present, rarely clear. But behind the blurred image was a persistent reality. His health was poor, his personality muted, and his body heavily medicated. From early adulthood, Albert Victor suffered from frequent respiratory issues. Weak lungs, chronic congestion, and periods of unexplained fatigue plagued him. He was described by contemporaries as delicate, fragile, and not quite suited to the rigors of leadership. Doctors struggled to agree on a precise diagnosis. Tuberculosis was suspected, as was some broader degenerative condition, but what they didn't struggle with was prescribing. Like so many royals before him, Albert Victor was given the medical holy trinity of the 19th century: laudanum for pain, ether for sleep, and chloroform when things got really uncomfortable. His use of narcotic treatments wasn't scandalous, just routine. At court, it was referred to as managing his nerves. In private letters, euphemisms flowed: the little fog, medicated rest, my tonic. Everyone knew what it meant. He was dosed frequently and quietly, the way one would tend to a valuable but unstable artifact. On bad days, he would disappear for hours, sometimes days, under the care of palace physicians, emerging groggy but composed, his symptoms managed, never cured. There were rumors, of course. Not the kind that made the papers, but the kind that slipped through the corridors of royal households and into the letters of foreign dignitaries. Whispers that Albert Victor's mind was soft, that his energy was blunted, that his behavior was gentle to the point of disconnection. None of this was confirmed, but much of it was believed, especially as his reliance on medicinal sedation became more frequent. The line between medical treatment and dependency was thin, if it existed at all. Ether and chloroform, early anesthetics popular in the late Victorian era, were known to create not just relief, but euphoria, even hallucinations. For someone like Albert Victor, already half removed from the demands of public life, the temptation to escape further must have been immense. These substances were often administered as preventatives before public appearances. Calm the nerves, brighten the cheeks, slow the breath. But beneath the royal veneer there was a man increasingly disconnected from the world he was meant to inherit. His speeches were vague, his engagements were minimal. His legacy, largely erased by time, left only two enduring shadows: the mysterious circumstances of his early death in 1892 at the age of 28, and the quietly persistent theory that he was never really meant for the throne. He faded out before he could disappoint anyone. But the real mystery wasn't his early death. It was how thoroughly his absence was accepted, how cleanly he was erased from history, like a dream too drowsy to remember. His sister, however, Princess Louise, was not so easily forgotten. Artistic, independent, and tormented in her own way, she found her solace not in duty, but in morphine. 8. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. In a family overflowing with dutiful daughters and somber sons, Princess Louise was the royal wild card. The sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Louise was artistic, fiercely intelligent, and allergic to boredom. She sculpted, she painted, she challenged social norms. She asked inconvenient questions. And at some point in her adulthood, she developed a close, complicated relationship with pain and the substances prescribed to numb it. Louise's legacy has often been airbrushed into that of a high society bohemian, the artist princess who dabbled in scandal but remained ultimately respectable. But behind the oil portraits and marble busts lies a story of chronic illness, private suffering, and frequent reliance on drugs that would today fall squarely under the category of medical narcotics. Her name surfaces again and again in Victorian medical correspondences, often accompanied by polite euphemisms. Neuralgia, nervous collapse, delicate condition. Each of these, in context, usually meant one thing: opium, laudanum, or later, morphine. Her health troubles were persistent and mysterious. Louise complained for years of migraines, insomnia, and sudden collapses in energy. Physicians struggled to find a unifying cause, and so they treated each symptom as it came, usually with a small brown bottle of laudanum or an increasingly common syringe of morphine. At first, the doses were conservative, then routine, then constant. For Louise, the appeal of narcotics likely extended beyond pain relief. They offered a soft reprieve from the cage of royalty itself. She had always chafed at the rigidity of court life, hated the protocols, and questioned the point of it all. Her mother, Queen Victoria, both admired and resented her. Louise wasn't content to be a quiet ornament. She insisted on education. She worked with artists. She even gave public speeches, unheard of at the time for a woman, let alone a princess. Still, Louise couldn't escape the institution she was born into. In 1871, she married John Campbell, the Marquis of Lorne, a political match that baffled the press and reportedly displeased the Queen. Though the marriage was initially praised as a modern love match, it was by most accounts cold, distant, and plagued by long periods of separation. Louise's health declined not long after. She began withdrawing from court functions, citing exhaustion. She took extended rests in the countryside, often under the care of private doctors. Letters from her lady-in-waiting describe a woman wrapped in a strange stillness, often confined to bed, increasingly reliant on what was delicately referred to as medicinal assistance. Morphine was the likely culprit, administered to dull her chronic pain, her restlessness, and, one suspects, her unhappiness. And yet, like many in her family, Louise remained outwardly composed. She continued her artistic work. She maintained a dignified public image. But the signs were there: the absences, the private retreats, the slurred replies at public dinners, and the perpetual shuffle between different health advisors. By the time she reached old age, Louise had all but vanished from the public consciousness. Less a princess, more a cautionary tale about what happens when a woman born into power has nowhere to place her pain. And pain, in the House of Windsor, was rarely isolated. Louise's youngest sister, Princess Beatrice, would also learn the royal formula: duty, sorrow, silence, and just enough laudanum to make it all bearable. 9. Princess Beatrice, youngest daughter of Queen Victoria. Princess Beatrice was born into a family already steeped in mourning. The ninth and final child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, she entered the world just as her mother was descending into lifelong widowhood. Unlike her older siblings, who had fled into marriages, foreign courts, or quiet rebellion, Beatrice stayed. She was the last child, the designated companion, the daughter who would never leave. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an unspoken royal contract. And Beatrice, ever obedient, signed it in silence. Her reward was a kind of captivity. Beatrice lived in the long shadow of Queen Victoria's grief. Her mother's mourning became the wallpaper of her life. Black dresses, hushed corridors, closed doors, and constant emotional weight. There were no grand affairs or glittering escapes for Beatrice. Her daily life was composed of duty, silence, and the physical symptoms that come from quietly absorbing everyone else's sorrow. As she moved through adolescence into adulthood, Beatrice developed what her physicians called a delicate nervous system. That phrase, popular among 19th century doctors who didn't quite know what else to call chronic anxiety and fatigue, became a kind of diagnosis in itself. She suffered from severe migraines, episodes of faintness, and what was politely described as insomnia related to emotional strain. The prescription, of course, was laudanum. She began taking small doses for her migraines, which were debilitating and frequent. Over time, those doses grew, both in volume and purpose. The laudanum wasn't just for the headaches anymore. It was for the nerves, the tension, the endless rituals of court life under a mother who did not allow disobedience or distance. Beatrice was her constant shadow, even as the queen aged into further bitterness and paranoia. The cost of loyalty was exhaustion, and the cure was a bottle on the nightstand. When Beatrice fell in love with Prince Henry of Battenberg, the court was stunned, not because she wished to marry, but because she wished to leave. Queen Victoria opposed the union until Beatrice agreed to a compromise. She could marry, but she and her husband would live with the queen forever. And so they did. Beatrice's married life was short and laced with grief. Her husband died of malaria during a military expedition in Africa, leaving her a widow in her early 30s. Her response was stoic, composed, and chemically assisted. From that point on, her dependence on laudanum intensified. She took it for sleep. She took it for headaches. She took it, as one courtier noted, as quietly as one might pour a cup of tea. Beatrice grew old in the palace, her routines shrinking with each passing year. She became a custodian of memory, editing her mother's diaries, preserving the family's image, keeping the curtains drawn. The outside world moved on. Beatrice stayed in the same black gowns, the same corridors, the same cloud of fragrant medicinal silence. And yet, even in this quietude, she was not the most visibly medicated royal of her generation. That title belonged to someone far flashier, far more photographed, and far less able to hide her habits. Her name was Princess Margaret, and her addictions didn't come in glass vials. They came in headlines. 10. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. Princess Margaret was born with everything: glamour, title, press coverage, and that particular brand of doomed allure that always seems to cling to second-born royals. The younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, she lived her entire life as the royal who could have, but didn't. She wasn't destined to rule, which meant she was free, or at least as free as one can be in a family that equates emotion with weakness and visibility with duty. And into that peculiar vacuum of expectation and performance, Margaret poured everything: parties, rebellion, lovers, vodka, and pills. By the 1950s, Margaret had become Britain's most photographed royal, an icon of mid-century glamour and defiance. Her style was immaculate, her wit cutting, her social circle dizzyingly bohemian. She chain-smoked in ball gowns, drank scotch before noon, and cultivated a cultivated image of aristocratic mischief. But behind the Chanel sunglasses and practiced pout was a woman unraveling, quietly, stylishly, chemically. Margaret's introduction to pharmaceuticals began the way most aristocratic dependencies do: innocently, medically, and with the full approval of a physician. The stress of royal life, heartbreak from the forbidden romance with Group Captain Peter Townsend, and the strain of public scrutiny led to insomnia, anxiety, and frequent migraines. Doctors prescribed sleeping pills, then tranquilizers, then painkillers, and Margaret took them all, with increasing regularity. She reportedly carried sedatives in her handbag. Friends and biographers noted her peculiar rhythm of wakefulness: groggy mornings, high-energy afternoons, and strange mood swings that couldn't always be explained by alcohol alone. In an era when upper-class women were expected to be elegantly fragile, Margaret's pharmaceutical routine was barely questioned. She was a woman of nerves, they said, a delicate constitution, a sensitive spirit. In reality, she was medicating away decades of isolation, resentment, and the unbearable dullness of being royal without purpose. Her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, offered a brief window of escape. He was artistic, exciting, irreverent. For a time, they were London's most dazzling couple. She, the royal rebel, he, the renegade photographer. But beneath the surface, the relationship was turbulent, and Margaret's emotional volatility deepened. By the 1970s, her drug use had become part of the routine. Not explosive, not scandalous, just constant. The kind of thing everyone knew and no one said aloud. Painkillers for headaches, sleeping pills for rest, tranquilizers for the long hours spent playing the role of someone she no longer believed herself to be. By the time Margaret reached her later years, the toll was visible. Her health declined sharply. She suffered multiple strokes, lost much of her mobility, and eventually became something of a recluse. The public, once enchanted by her defiance, watched with a mixture of pity and detachment. She had become a cautionary tale in pearls. But Margaret was never truly tragic, at least not in the Shakespearean sense. She was trapped. Trapped between freedom and expectation, modernity and monarchy, public image and private collapse. And in the void between all of that, there was always a pill for something. Still, for all her high society dramas, Margaret's use of medication fit the modern mold. Prescription pads, pharmacy labels, controlled substances. The generation before her didn't need any of that. They had morphine on demand, and King George V had it by the syringe. 11. George V. He was the monarch who held the British Empire together through war, revolution, and the slow disintegration of colonial confidence. King George V, with his carefully trimmed beard and famously frugal habits, was often described as dull but dependable, a man of protocol, punctuality, and exactly zero charm. He liked stamps. He disliked nonsense. He wore stiff collars and kept tighter schedules than most clocks. But for all his military discipline and imperial gravity, George V was no stranger to pain. And he managed it with the cold efficiency of a man who preferred injections over introspection. His health was never robust. Years of smoking, relentless public duty, and stress left him prone to respiratory problems, stomach issues, and bouts of exhaustion. By the 1920s, his breathing had become labored. He developed chronic bronchitis, recurring pleurisy, and the kind of lingering malaise that Victorian doctors euphemistically labeled decline. His appetite waned. His weight dropped. His capacity for endurance shrank, even as the performance of monarchy continued. And so began the slow, steady course of narcotic intervention. George V was treated by Lord Dawson of Penn, his trusted physician, who, like many royal doctors of the time, believed that pain was unnecessary when medicine could simply remove it. Under Dawson's care, the king was regularly administered morphine and cocaine for a wide range of ailments. Morphine soothed the body, cocaine lifted the spirits. It was a balance system, one to numb, one to energize. Entire days were scaffolded around his injections. This was not scandalous, not then. It was considered enlightened. Dawson believed it was not only appropriate but humane to treat royal suffering with the strongest remedies available. And George, ever the pragmatist, complied without complaint. He had little patience for suffering, his own or others. If pain could be bypassed, it should be. And morphine did the job. His dependency became apparent during the later years of his reign. There were extended absences from public view. He often appeared drowsy, distant, or slow to respond during formal engagements. Official records were vague: rest, recuperation, treatment for congestion. But insiders knew. The king was under near constant pharmaceutical management. By 1936, George V was dying. His lungs were failing. His body, weakened by decades of stress and medication, had little strength left. And here is where history veers into quiet controversy. Lord Dawson, perhaps eager to preserve royal dignity, delivered a fatal injection of morphine and cocaine, not out of cruelty, but choreography. The timing of the king's death was arranged so the announcement could appear in the morning papers, rather than the undignified evening editions. It was the monarchy, managed to the very last breath. George V never openly spoke of his medications. He was not a reflective man, but he stands as a perfect emblem of royal stoicism, medicated into function, propped up by syringes, numbed by chemistry, and remembered not for his suffering, but for surviving long enough to hand off the crown in a time of crisis. His legacy, oddly, is one of restraint. Not emotional restraint, but chemical. And that legacy would pass directly into his son. George VI didn't inherit his father's confidence, but he did inherit the morphine, and he needed it for far more than just the pain. 12. George VI. George VI never wanted the crown. He never wanted the microphone, the spotlight, or the weight of empire either. But in 1936, when his older brother abdicated in a blaze of romantic scandal and constitutional drama, the shy, stammering Duke of York was shoved into the throne like a substitute teacher summoned mid-fire drill. The world remembers him as the reluctant king who found his voice. What it rarely remembers, at least not out loud, is that he did so while heavily medicated. George VI, born Albert, was already battling a lifelong stammer when he became king. He also suffered from ulcers, chronic stomach pain, recurring lung infections, and a nervous system that seemed permanently wired to tension. From childhood, he had been the anxious one, the sensitive spare, overlooked and underprepared. And so, like many royals before him, he was introduced early to the familiar comforts of prescribed sedation. Initially, it was mild, a sleeping draught here, a tincture there, but over time, and particularly during the early years of his reign, his reliance on opiates and barbiturates deepened. Public speaking, ceremonial appearances, and even routine engagements required an emotional steadiness that his body simply didn't provide. The solution was pharmaceutical, injections and pills before important speeches, sedatives at night to calm the panic, morphine-based painkillers when the stomach pain returned, barbiturates when the nerves took over. These weren't vices, they were royal infrastructure. The Second World War only made things worse. George insisted on staying in London during the Blitz, walking through bombed-out neighborhoods and visiting hospitals, projecting a stoic calm that people found inspiring. And it was inspiring, until you realized that behind every appearance was a cocktail of painkillers and nerve medication calibrated down to the hour. He couldn't have done it without them. And perhaps more tellingly, he didn't try to. His physicians managed his schedule as carefully as they managed his chemistry. During the war years, George was often described as unwell but present, a phrase that says more than it means. His voice, immortalized in wartime broadcasts, was steadied not just by speech therapists, but by measured doses of tranquilizers. His stomach was held in check by sedatives. His nerves, constantly monitored and medicated. And then came the cancer. George VI was a lifelong smoker, and by the late 1940s, it caught up with him. He developed lung cancer, underwent a pneumonectomy, surgical removal of an entire lung, and suffered intensely in the aftermath. The treatment was textbook royal: more morphine, more sedatives, heavier doses. Toward the end of his life, he was rarely without pharmaceutical assistance. His days were a slow choreography of medication, punctuated by brief appearances and longer recoveries. But still, he endured. He gave speeches, waved from balconies, and wore the mask of a monarch. Behind the scenes, though, the drug use was no longer about function. It was about survival. He wasn't high. He was holding on. And when he finally slipped away in 1952, it was after a slow decline overseen by palace physicians who understood what was needed: dignity, silence, and enough medication to ensure both. His wife, Queen Mary, had watched this unfold before, and she too had her own quiet collection of cures. Not for illness necessarily, but for the nerves that royalty never quite cured. 13. Queen Mary, Mary of Tech. Queen Mary, consort to George V and mother to George VI, looked every inch the embodiment of imperial majesty. She was the kind of royal who seemed to emerge from marble, unflinching posture, pursed dignity, and that signature expression of regal disapproval that could curdle milk at 10 paces. But behind the tiaras and family heirlooms, Mary of Teck was not as immovable as she appeared. She was brittle, made hard by duty and tragedy, and over time, she found comfort in the same substance so many of her family had relied upon, laudanum. Her name rarely appears in lists of scandal or controversy. That's because Queen Mary was a master of concealment. Raised in modest royal obscurity and thrust into greatness through marriage, she was obsessed with appearances, tradition, and control. But even the most disciplined royals bleed on the inside. And in Queen Mary's case, the bleeding came in the form of insomnia, nervous ailments, and decades of grief that she refused to name aloud. Laudanum was prescribed to her early in her marriage, initially for sleep troubles, which were frequent. George V was a difficult man, cold, militaristic, emotionally unavailable. Their marriage, while politically solid, was not exactly warm. Over time, Mary's health began to reflect her internal world. Restless nights, headaches, fatigue, and what physicians delicately called feminine exhaustion. Her response was not emotional, it was pharmaceutical. She took laudanum in small, regular doses. It helped her sleep. It eased her nerves. It quieted the racing thoughts that came from raising a brood of children under the crushing expectations of royal performance. 5 sons and a daughter, each born into a world of scrutiny. She was determined to shape them into monarchs, soldiers, and proper Windsor prototypes, even if it meant detachment. She did not coddle, she did not bend, and she certainly did not speak of weakness. But laudanum was a silent companion. After World War I, with the monarchy's popularity rattled and revolutions sweeping across Europe, Queen Mary doubled down on formality. And behind closed doors, she doubled down on the medications that kept her steady. Letters from court staff refer vaguely to Her Majesty's rest remedies and evening doses, coded language familiar to anyone who's read between the lines of palace diaries. The losses mounted. The death of her youngest son, Prince John, in 1919 devastated her, though she rarely admitted it aloud. Her husband's slow decline into morphine dependency didn't go unnoticed. And when George V died, it was Mary who kept the machinery running, stone-faced and corseted, while the rest of the family fractured. Well into her widowhood, she maintained a strict daily schedule, an increasingly quiet social presence. By the 1940s, she had become a living symbol, more than a participant, appearing at ceremonies, hosting foreign dignitaries, and then retreating behind walls of velvet and Valium-adjacent sleep tonics. The medicine remained part of her routine. Queen Mary never had a public scandal. She never slurred in public, never disappeared for rest cures, never left a visible trace. But her nerves, tightly wired and meticulously hidden, told their own story. And her daughter, Princess Mary, Princess Royal, inherited more than her mother's sense of duty. She inherited the same nervous exhaustion and the same cure. 14. Princess Mary, Princess Royal, daughter of George V. If Queen Mary was the rigid backbone of the monarchy, her daughter Princess Mary was the quiet pulse just beneath it, steady, overlooked, and endlessly dutiful. Born into the core of the royal household in 1897, Mary grew up surrounded by men of power, mothers of steel, and a nation that expected every royal woman to serve, smile, and never slip. And like so many of her predecessors, she internalized those expectations until they pressed against her bones. The press liked to call her the soldier's princess, a tribute to her tireless service during World War I, where she visited hospitals, supported the Red Cross, and lent her name to charitable causes. She was composed, capable, and practical, especially compared to the more dramatic tendencies of some of her brothers. But under the surface, Mary suffered from what her physicians called nervous exhaustion, a vague yet fashionable diagnosis in the early 20th century that often meant anxiety, insomnia, or long-term emotional depletion. For this, she was prescribed the same familiar family remedy, laudanum, later supplemented by morphine-based tonics as medical fashion shifted and her ailments worsened. Mary's dependence didn't begin in scandal or indulgence. It began in service. War work, public appearances, grueling travel, and the constant pressure to embody grace left her physically drained and psychologically strained. She never showed it publicly, but behind the palace doors, there were extended periods of rest, missed functions, and quiet withdrawals under the pretense of recuperation. Physicians advised rest and regular sedation, first to calm her nerves, later to relieve physical pain from recurring bouts of what was politely described as female troubles and migraines. Unlike her royal relatives who masked their dependency in eccentric behavior or erratic schedules, Mary handled hers with the predictability of a filing cabinet. Everything in her life was orderly, and that included her drug use, daily doses, measured intervals, a routine that mimicked health but quietly replaced it. She could walk into a hospital ward and make small talk with wounded soldiers, then return to her quarters and collapse into chemically induced sleep. It was all part of the job. Her marriage to Viscount Lascelles, later the 6th Earl of Harewood, offered stability, but not necessarily passion. It was a respectable match. They lived mostly away from the main royal drama, tucked into Yorkshire estates and quiet social functions. But the nerves followed her, and so did the medicine. As she aged, her ailments grew more persistent. Her doctors shifted her from laudanum to morphine mixtures, and eventually to synthetic sedatives that allowed her to maintain her outward composure without losing full alertness. Mary didn't complain. She didn't rebel. She simply adjusted, taking her rest when needed, taking her medicine when offered, and keeping her suffering within the polite confines of royal discretion. She faded from public life slowly, without fanfare, without controversy. But behind her ironed gloves and fixed expressions was another royal story, written in dosage schedules and midnight refills. And her brother, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, would come to know the same hush of palace medicine, only his version was haunted not just by nerves, but by deeper fractures that opiates alone couldn't mend. 15. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, son of George V. In a family where decorum was mandatory and emotional weather was managed with stony silence or a politely labeled bottle, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was born into a system that offered little room for fragility. He was the third son of George V and Queen Mary, which meant he was far enough from the throne to be expendable, but close enough to be expected. Expected to behave, expected to serve, expected to cope. And he did, until he didn't. On paper, Prince Henry lived the royal script. He attended Eton, he served in the military, he fulfilled ceremonial duties with the practiced smile of a man who knew his role but never quite looked comfortable in it. There was something strained about him, something always just behind the eyes. Family members, even those notoriously tight-lipped about emotional matters, often described him as tense, rigid, or not well suited to public life. What they didn't say out loud, but often hinted at in letters and staff diaries, was that Henry struggled with physical health, with mental stability, and eventually with medication. His health problems began subtly in his 30s. Chronic fatigue, insomnia, unexplained pain in the joints and back, periods of deep lethargy followed by nervous agitation. Royal physicians, faithful to tradition, did not seek out underlying causes. Instead, they reached for their old standbys, opiate-based sedatives, prescribed liberally to relieve pain, calm anxiety, and create the illusion of balance. For Henry, the illusion became the norm. He was not flamboyant like his brother, Edward VIII, nor beloved like George VI. He was reserved, often painfully so, and increasingly reclusive as he aged. His dependence on narcotic sedatives wasn't overt. It didn't make headlines or prompt scandal. But those who worked closest to him began to notice the signs. Slurred speech during public engagements, unexplained absences, and a growing reliance on long rest cures at country estates. These episodes were usually blamed on stress or fatigue. Behind closed doors, they were managed with morphine tinctures and sleep-inducing compounds, quietly, as all royal ailments were. By the 1950s, Prince Henry was described in internal palace communications as having serious difficulty with energy and focus. Though he continued to appear at state functions, it became clear that his capacity was waning. His use of opiates and sedatives had become more than medicinal. It was structural. It enabled his continued visibility. Without them, he likely wouldn't have been able to stand through long ceremonies or manage the unpredictable pangs of anxiety that plagued him during speeches. In 1974, he suffered a major stroke that left him incapacitated. Afterward, he faded almost entirely from public life, a once prominent royal turned quiet footnote. He spent his final years in fragile health, cared privately and almost entirely out of the public eye. He passed away in 1974 at age 74, remembered, if remembered at all, as the quiet brother who stood in when others couldn't and sat down when the pressure became too much. But within this subdued legacy is a familiar pattern, the quiet spiral, the royal prescription pad, and the slow dissolving of a man behind a medicated curtain. Yet if Prince Henry hid his struggle, his younger brother Prince George, Duke of Kent, did not. His life burned fast, bright, and high, on morphine, cocaine, and a scandalous edge no amount of royal protocol could contain. 16. Prince George, Duke of Kent, son of George V. If Prince Henry was the quiet brother who folded into the shadows, Prince George, Duke of Kent, was the opposite. Dazzling, volatile, and famously difficult to categorize. He was the fourth son of George V and Queen Mary, a royal born into an already crowded lineage, and perhaps because of that, he sought his identity outside the usual palace channels. And where he looked, behind velvet curtains and glittering nightclubs, on the fringes of royal protocol, he found exactly what he was looking for: escape, reinvention, and more than a few chemical companions. Prince George didn't just flirt with vice. He dated it, courted it, turned it into an aesthetic. His life was a chaotic blend of military service, artistic friendships, discreet affairs, and a growing affinity for cocaine and morphine. Two substances that, in the early 20th century, were still shockingly easy to obtain if you had the right name and the right money. He had both. What set George apart wasn't merely his access to drugs. It was the frequency and openness with which he used them, at least in the company of those who understood discretion. Within the inner circles of bohemian London, George became known not as a wayward prince, but as a royal who indulged with the same boldness others merely whispered about. He didn't need to rebel with politics or ideology. He rebelled with sensation. Those who knew him well described a man of contradictions, charming and cold, magnetic and moody, disarmingly elegant yet clearly restless. He could be the life of the room one minute and disappear into a velvet settee the next. And when he vanished, it wasn't always clear whether he was napping, sedated, or simply drifting in the warm current of a carefully dosed injection. George's drug use wasn't limited to parties. It extended into his private life, into moments of anxiety, insomnia, and the chronic pressure of being a royal without purpose. His father disapproved of his lifestyle. His mother was horrified by the rumors. His brothers didn't know what to do with him. He was too charming to disown and too unruly to manage. Doctors were summoned often, usually to treat what they diplomatically called fatigue-related collapses. What they were really treating were the side effects of chemical dependence: tremors, paranoia, severe mood swings, and sudden physical exhaustion. In at least one documented episode, George required extended bed rest under medical supervision after what court insiders described as a misjudged dose. No one elaborated. Yet, despite his instability, he remained a public figure. He held military rank, represented the monarchy abroad, and maintained the outward elegance expected of a Windsor. But the drugs were always there, silently stitched into the lining of his lifestyle. In 1942, at just 39 years old, George died in a mysterious plane crash in Scotland while on active service. The circumstances, remain vague. Official reports say mechanical error, though alternative theories persist. What's certain is that his story ended abruptly, a final smash cut in a life already edited around excess. He was perhaps the first truly modern royal addict, less a victim of Victorian medicine, more a harbinger of 20th century disintegration. But the tragedy of drug dependence in the House of Windsor didn't end with George. It reached even the youngest, most innocent branch of the tree, Prince John, the forgotten child, whose epilepsy was soothed with narcotics too powerful for a boy and too convenient for a family that preferred silence. 17. Prince John, son of George V. Of all the children of George V and Queen Mary, none were more quietly erased than Prince John, the youngest, the sickliest, the royal child history tried to forget. Born in 1905 into the strict machinery of the British monarchy, John was sweet-natured, artistic, and by many accounts full of energy in his early years. But his life would soon be defined not by his personality, but by his epilepsy, a condition the royal household found not only difficult to manage, but deeply inconvenient. As John's seizures became more frequent and severe in his childhood, the official line was to protect him from the pressures of court life. But the unspoken truth was that epilepsy, in that era, was considered a source of shame, something to be hidden, softened, and, if possible, chemically silenced. And that's exactly what they tried to do. From his earliest episodes, John was placed under the care of palace doctors who followed the accepted medical practices of the early 20th century, which is to say, narcotic sedation. He was given barbiturates, bromide mixtures, and most notably, opiate-based treatments to manage both the seizures and the behaviors associated with his condition. These drugs, while considered therapeutic at the time, were strong enough to induce sleep, suppress movement, and blunt emotional responses. The goal was simple: keep John calm, quiet, and manageable. Initially, he remained within the family circle, present at some royal functions, photographed occasionally, still a visible Windsor. But as his condition worsened, so did his isolation. By the time he was around 11, John had been quietly relocated to Wood Farm, a secluded cottage on the Sandringham estate. It was described in official statements as a peaceful country retreat for the prince's health. In practice, it was a royal exile. There he lived under near-constant medical supervision. His attendants were kind but instructed to maintain routine and silence. The drugs continued, administered daily, sometimes more than once, intended to prevent seizures, reduce hyperactivity, and protect the fragile image of royal infallibility. These weren't the wild excesses of an adult addict. They were clinical, prescribed, measured. Yet the effect was eerily similar. John's letters became shorter, simpler. Visitors noted how drowsy he often seemed. His vibrant personality, the one described so lovingly by his nurse, Lala Bill, appeared to dull over time. Whether it was the seizures, the medication, or the loneliness, no one could say for sure. But the boy who once loved riding his bicycle through the gardens became increasingly detached, both physically and emotionally. In 1919, at just 13 years old, Prince John died after a major seizure. His death, like his life, was handled with solemn discretion. The royal family expressed private grief, but made few public statements. Queen Mary's diary entry was notably brief. "A great shock, though not unexpected," she wrote. And then she moved on. John remains the most tragic of all royal children, not because of his illness, but because of what that illness revealed. The monarchy's discomfort with vulnerability, its instinct to medicate what it could not manage, and its quiet willingness to trade authenticity for composure. But that instinct didn't die with him. It followed his brother's widow, Prince Philip's wife, into the next generation, where sedatives became as commonplace as duty. Only this time, it was Prince Philip himself who took the pills. Not for weakness, but for sleep. Always for sleep. 18. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. In the pantheon of royal figures who seemed impervious to frailty, Prince Philip stood tall, sharp-tongued, stoic, and seemingly made of naval rope and sarcasm. The public saw him as blunt, durable, and occasionally inappropriate, but always, somehow, indestructible. He was the man who walked 2 steps behind the Queen for over 7 decades, rarely revealing a flicker of weakness. But even steel gets tired. Even admirals lose sleep. And Prince Philip? He rarely slept without help. Unlike many of his predecessors whose reliance on opiates or morphine slid quietly into dependency, Philip's pharmaceutical habits were functional, intentional, and always contained, but no less persistent. He was known for a lifelong battle with insomnia, and while he never flaunted it, he never entirely concealed it either. Throughout much of his adult life, particularly from middle age onward, he reportedly relied on barbiturates and sedatives, the mid-20th century's acceptable solution to the human body, refusing to turn off at night. What's striking is that Philip's case wasn't born from illness, addiction, or collapse. It was born from the same thing that turned so many royals toward medication: pressure. As a naval officer, Philip had grown accustomed to structure, control, and sleep measured in tight intervals between orders. But once he entered the royal fold as the Queen's consort, he found himself locked in an entirely different rhythm, one dictated by ceremonial appearances, public scrutiny, diplomatic visits, and the unspoken rule that he remain relevant but not central, visible but not dominant. In this strange half-life, insomnia took root. The stress of maintaining identity in a system designed to absorb it quietly gnawed at him. Not enough to provoke public breakdowns or scandal, but enough that sleep became a battleground. And rather than wage it by tossing and turning, Philip turned to modern medicine. The sleeping pills he used were, by all accounts, prescribed and monitored. In the 1950s and 60s, barbiturates were standard for cases of persistent insomnia. Later, more modern tranquilizers and non-narcotic sleep aids replaced them. Philip, ever practical, embraced whatever worked. He took them to get through long-haul flights, to recover from punishing schedules, and to regulate his increasingly fractured sleep patterns. He needed to be alert for public life, and that required rest. Rest that didn't come naturally. There's little evidence of excess, no overdoses, no public episodes, no erratic behavior. But courtiers and palace insiders occasionally noted that the Duke could be slow in the mornings or remarkably quiet after travel. Those close to him knew what that meant. The medication worked, but like all things in the royal household, it came with its own cost. A subtle dulling of edges, a slight delay in reaction, the gradual adaptation of a body dependent on a scheduled dose to function normally. Still, Philip never let it define him. He lived a famously active life, sports, speeches, charities, and tireless travel well into his 90s. But the sleep never came easily. It never had. And so, night after night, for decades, he accepted the palace-approved answer to exhaustion: a small pill, a dark room, and a silence deeper than rest. But if Philip's use of sedatives was discreet and measured, the monarch he descended from, George III, was treated with opium not for sleep, but for something far more misunderstood: madness. And his doctors kept dosing long after reason had left the room. 19. George III. To most schoolchildren, George III is the mad king who lost America. To historians, he's a far more complex figure, a diligent monarch, deeply moral, oddly sympathetic, and tormented by a mind that periodically unraveled. But to his physicians, George III was something else entirely, a royal patient to be subdued, managed, and chemically restrained. And for decades the instrument of that restraint came in liquid form, opium, delivered as tinctures, drafts, and soothing elixirs. His descent into mental illness is one of the most studied and speculated about in royal history. Today, many scholars suspect he suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that can cause confusion, hallucinations, and intense abdominal pain. Others point to bipolar disorder, or even arsenic poisoning. At the time, though, his symptoms were simply labeled madness, and the treatments were designed not to heal, but to quiet. George began experiencing symptoms in his early 40s, bouts of confusion, frantic speech, insomnia, and erratic behavior. Court physicians recorded long stretches where he would speak without stopping for hours, pacing through the halls, unable to sleep, unable to rest. The palace, unaccustomed to public displays of unfiltered emotion, quickly went into crisis mode, and with no clear cure in sight, they did what they had always done. They reached for opium. Opium-derived medicines were administered to George III regularly throughout his later reign. Sometimes it was laudanum, mixed into wine or tea. Other times it was opium pills, dosed in careful intervals. These treatments were intended to calm his episodes, reduce his agitation, and restore him to something resembling composure. Occasionally they worked, temporarily. More often they dulled him just enough to keep him still. And stillness in the royal context was everything. It's worth noting that these were not fringe treatments. Opium was the gold standard for both physical and mental ailments at the time. What makes George's case so tragic is not that he was treated with drugs, but that the drugs were used as a substitute for understanding. The more erratic he became, the more heavily he was dosed. When that failed, he was simply restrained, physically, then chemically, and always under the guise of care. During his longest episodes of illness, George was confined to Kew Palace, away from the public eye. The palace staff kept detailed notes, some of which described days of near comatose silence, where the king would barely speak, his hands trembling, his thoughts unreachable. Other times, the drugs wore off too soon, and the agitation returned. Physicians upped the dosage. There were brief recoveries. In those windows, George tried to resume royal duties, write letters, and pretend things were fine. But the episodes returned, longer, darker, and more frequent. By the final decade of his life, he was blind, profoundly confused, and largely cut off from the world. The medications didn't save him. They simply softened the edges of his suffering, for the comfort of those around him, not necessarily for his own. And through it all, Queen Charlotte, his wife, watched in silence, tending to the shadows of a marriage undone by madness, and quietly beginning her own long affair with laudanum. Not to escape his illness, but to endure it. 20. Queen Charlotte, wife of George III. Queen Charlotte was not the kind of royal who invited drama. She was dignified, intelligent, musically gifted, and devoted to her role as consort. For much of her life, she played the part expected of her. Decorous wife, prolific mother, and refined moral compass of the court. But duty has its limits, especially when married to a man slowly unraveling before your eyes. Charlotte's adult life was spent in tandem with George III's decline. His descent into mental illness was long, unpredictable, and deeply destabilizing, not just for the monarchy, but for the woman expected to stand beside him, smile graciously, and never publicly crack. And so, like many royal women before and after her, she turned to something quiet, legal, and effective: laudanum. Laudanum, an opium and alcohol tincture, wasn't considered indulgent. It was standard, respectable, even ladylike. It was prescribed for sleeplessness, nerves, and all manner of Victorian distress. And in Charlotte's case, it became less of a treatment and more of a daily ritual. The Queen began taking laudanum in small doses sometime in the late 1780s, when George's illness began to intensify. At first, it was simply for rest. Her letters describe restless nights and strange forebodings, 19th century phrasing for anxiety and insomnia. As the King's condition worsened, so did her symptoms. She was not allowed to grieve publicly, nor was she allowed to express frustration, sadness, or fear. She was the wife of a king whose mind was failing, and her job was to appear stable. Her health declined accordingly. Court physicians prescribed her increasingly frequent doses of laudanum throughout the 1790s. These prescriptions were accompanied by polite nods toward female fatigue, domestic strain, and delicacy of nerves. But beneath those euphemisms was a more uncomfortable truth. Charlotte was breaking. Quietly, elegantly, but undeniably. And instead of being permitted space to collapse, she was simply given more drops. Her correspondence during this period becomes sparse. What letters do survive contain subtle, coded references to her mental state. One note to a friend mentions the blessed stillness that comes at evening, which historians believe may refer to her laudanum doses. Another speaks of the nights when I remember nothing until morning, a phrase that could describe either sleep or chemical sedation. Charlotte's appearance changed. Once lively and musically engaged, she withdrew from her piano, limited her social engagements, and increasingly lived apart from George during his worst episodes. At court functions, she was described as alert but distracted, present though distant. Again, the drugs weren't the cause of her withdrawal. They were the only thing keeping her afloat within it. By the early 1800s, she was living largely in seclusion, making brief public appearances and spending long hours in private apartments. Her son, the future George IV, took on more responsibility as her husband became incapacitated. Charlotte remained, by title, Queen. But her reality was narrower. Small rooms, soft voices, and steady doses. She died in 1818, her final years defined not by scandal, but by slow erosion. A woman caught between history and heartbreak, medicated into tolerable stillness. And that heartbreak would be inherited, quite literally, by her daughter Princess Amelia, who found herself relying on the same bitter cure, only with more desperation and far less time. 21. Princess Amelia, daughter of George III. Princess Amelia, the youngest daughter of George III and Queen Charlotte, was born into a royal household already haunted by whispers and shadows. By the time she arrived in 1783, her father's mental state had begun its erratic decline, and her mother had long since retreated behind layers of obligation and opium. Amelia, delicate from birth, was her parents' last flicker of hope, beloved, sheltered, and tragically, the most fragile of them all. From early childhood, Amelia was known to be physically weak. She was prone to fevers, colds that lingered too long, and unexplained bouts of fatigue. Victorian doctors labeled her with a variety of vague diagnoses: nervous delicacy, inherited weakness, and the ever-present female disorder. But it wasn't until her late teens that her real condition revealed itself: tuberculosis, the slow, suffocating disease that robbed her of breath, strength, and eventually, mobility. Her suffering was relentless, and it was met with the only tools the royal physicians had to offer: laudanum and morphine, prescribed liberally and often. At first, it was just for the coughing fits, then for the chest pain, then for the anxiety, and then simply because she could no longer sleep without it. Amelia's world began to shrink. She moved between royal residences in search of cleaner air and softer climates, but there was no escape. Her letters from this period, when she could still write, are full of longing and drowsy sorrow. She writes of days that blur into each other, and medicines that keep the hours from hurting. She knew what was happening to her. and she knew there was no cure. Her reliance on opium-derived medications escalated quickly in her final years. Family members noted her increasing grogginess, her limited attention span, and her slow, slurred speech. But no one spoke of addiction. In the early 1800s, dependence on laudanum and morphine wasn't seen as weakness. It was seen as mercy. The royal family, always uncomfortable with vulnerability, quietly removed her from the public eye. She was relocated to Windsor, where her care was managed by a rotating team of physicians and ladies-in-waiting sworn to discretion. There, she lived in a state of half-consciousness, reading when she could, painting small watercolors, and waiting, always waiting, for relief. Her relationship with her father, George III, remained tender until the end. In her more lucid moments, she visited him, though by then his own mental state had deteriorated to the point of near silence. They were both ghosts in the same house, medicated into quiet submission, bound by illness and royal expectation. Amelia died in 1810 at the age of 27. Her death shattered George III, who was never told all the details of her decline. Some believe her loss marked the final break in his already fragile psyche. Others say it was simply the last cruelty in a life full of them. But for Amelia, the morphine had long since become a constant companion, one that dulled the pain not just of illness, but of isolation, futility, and the heavy stillness of being a dying daughter in a palace full of denial. And while she died quietly, one royal relative, Prince Frederick, Duke of York, would leave behind a trail of debts, military scandals, and chronic illness, all soothed, of course, by the exact same bottle. 22. Prince Frederick, Duke of York. If Prince Frederick, Duke of York, is remembered at all, it's often through a rhyme. The grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. A sing-song simplification of a complicated man. The second son of George III, Frederick was a military commander, a bureaucratic reformer, and a walking contradiction. At once disciplined and indulgent, dutiful and dependent, physically commanding but internally unwell. And like many of his siblings, he found his peace not in battle, nor in politics, but in a familiar 18th century prescription, laudanum, the empire's favorite potion. Frederick was not built for quiet suffering. He lived large, drank often, and presided over military affairs with the confidence of a man who could afford to get it wrong. And sometimes he did. His military career was rocky at best. His leadership during the Flanders campaign was criticized, and he became a figure of public mockery, accused of wasting lives, squandering resources, and marching his troops to nowhere in particular. Yet back at home, he became an effective reformer, streamlining the British Army's administration and laying foundations for future modernization. But while he fought to fix the military on paper, his own body was waging a very different kind of war. As he aged, Frederick developed severe gout, a common affliction in royal circles, worsened by lavish diets and sedentary routines. The attacks were excruciating, causing inflammation, joint pain, and periods of immobilization. His doctors, perhaps taking cues from the family handbook, turned quickly to opium-based sedatives. Laudanum was their first answer and their last one. It didn't cure the disease, but it made it tolerable. Sometimes. Barely. His dependence was not hidden. Court observers noted the frequency of his dosing, the dazed expressions during meetings, the long disappearances from public life. His correspondence in later years took on a meandering quality, thoughts wandering mid-sentence, ideas looping back on themselves. Some blamed age. Others suspected something more chemical. The truth likely sat between the two. Frederick was also plagued by a range of respiratory issues and episodes of nervous illness that today might be labeled as anxiety or panic disorder. These too were treated with tinctures, pills, and what physicians delicately called night medicines. Over time, the medications blended into his daily routine, as habitual as tea or prayer. There were reports of staff being instructed to keep doses within arm's reach, ready before public engagements, diplomatic meetings, or dinners with difficult company. By the 1820s, his health was in sharp decline. He became bloated, reclusive, and reliant on increasingly frequent sedation. The royal family maintained its usual silence, announcing only that the Duke was resting comfortably, even as he slipped further into dependency and physical collapse. He died in 1827, aged 63, with his legacy quietly shuffled into the archive of royal near misses. Not disgraced, not exalted, just forgotten. But his widowhood left one figure standing in the wings, Queen Caroline of Brunswick, estranged wife of George IV. She didn't fade quietly. She fought, scandalized, and endured her own set of afflictions, and, inevitably, she found her comfort in the exact same way. Through laudanum, reputation be damned. 23. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. If the British monarchy has ever had a true chaos agent, it might have been Queen Caroline of Brunswick. She arrived in England in 1795 to marry her cousin, George, Prince of Wales, later George IV. And from the moment her ship docked, everything began to unravel. Their marriage was a disaster before the ink dried. Their personalities clashed on every level. He was vain, dramatic, already addicted to laudanum and deeply in debt. She was blunt, eccentric, and wholly uninterested in playing the part of the submissive royal wife. But Caroline's story isn't just one of bad marriages and public scandal. It's also a quieter, more familiar royal tale. The slow, desperate turn toward medicinal sedation, not as recreation, but as a survival mechanism. Because behind her reputation for flamboyance and defiance was a woman suffering from years of isolation, emotional whiplash, and chronic physical illness, managed, like so many of her peers, with laudanum and other opiate-based treatments. By the early 1800s, Caroline had been effectively exiled from the royal inner circle. After the birth of her only child, Princess Charlotte, George abandoned her entirely, and Caroline was left in a kind of aristocratic limbo, technically still royal but politically sidelined and personally humiliated. She was monitored, restricted, and socially starved. Her responses to this treatment were both theatrical and erratic. Public appearances in odd places, outspoken commentary, long absences abroad. And with each return to England came fresh waves of gossip, whisper campaigns, and moral judgment. Some of that judgment, predictably, focused on her use of medication. Caroline reportedly began taking laudanum in her late 30s, initially prescribed for nervous palpitations, menstrual distress, and what doctors broadly referred to as hysteria. The medicine dulled her sharp edges. It also made her more erratic in appearance, some days unnervingly calm, others jittery or distant. Court physicians chalked it up to stress, but those closer to her saw the bottle always nearby, the doses growing, the intervals shortening. Her health declined further during her self-imposed exile across Europe. She lived in Italy for years, surrounded by an eccentric entourage, sometimes ill, often bedridden, always medicated. Foreign diplomats noted her increasingly inconsistent behavior, flickers of lucidity followed by long periods of sluggishness. She complained of nerve pain and trouble sleeping, and her letters from this period take on a cloudy, almost dreamlike quality. Whether her body was failing or her spirit was simply exhausted is hard to say. But the laudanum kept flowing. When George IV was crowned in 1821, Caroline returned to England to demand her rightful place beside him. What followed was a grotesque public spectacle. Parliament debated her worthiness, crowds rioted in her support, and George barricaded her from the coronation. Throughout it all, Caroline was physically frail, likely ill with undiagnosed cancer, and quietly leaning on narcotics just to stand upright. She died just weeks after being turned away from the ceremony. Officially, the cause was complications from her illness. Unofficially, it was everything at once: betrayal, exhaustion, pain, and a body long dependent on the tincture meant to save it. She exited, characteristically, with defiance. But her final years were lined with velvet bottles and the same bitter solution taken by so many royals before her. And in the next generation, King William IV, her brother-in-law, would inherit not just the throne, but the chronic pain and the opiates to match. 24. King William IV, the Sailor King. If King William IV was born with any single advantage, it was low expectations. As the third son of George III, he wasn't groomed for the throne. He spent much of his early life at sea, far from the suffocating rituals of court life, earning the nickname the Sailor King. That nickname stuck, mostly because he was rough around the edges, irritable in meetings, and wholly uninterested in royal pretense. But beneath the image of the crusty old mariner turned monarch was a man in constant grinding pain. And, predictably, his answer was opium. William served in the Royal Navy from adolescence, beginning at age 13. He fought in the American Revolutionary War, lived hard, ate poorly, and sustained injuries that followed him for the rest of his life. By his mid-40s, he was already suffering from chronic gout, joint stiffness, and mysterious nerve pain that would today be classified under any number of autoimmune disorders. The treatment, of course, was simple: strong opiates, prescribed liberally and administered without fuss. This was not unusual for military men of the era. Among sailors and officers alike, opium was standard issue, a way to sleep through pain, endure long sea voyages, and silence the body's protest during active duty. For William, this early relationship with narcotics laid the foundation for a lifelong dependency. When he returned to civilian life, and later to the royal court, he brought the habit with him. He didn't speak about it much, nor did anyone else. His physicians recorded regular use of laudanum for pain management, particularly for the swelling in his legs and the stiffness in his hands. Court diaries note his irritability when denied his medicine, and his tendency to take to his bed for several days at a time, often after doses that were, by 19th century standards, considerable. His accession to the throne in 1830, following the death of his brother George IV, was unexpected and reluctant. William was in his mid-60s, already in poor health, and completely unprepared for the demands of kingship. He complained constantly of pain, especially during long parliamentary sessions or ceremonial events. The solution was always the same: more laudanum before state occasions, sometimes paired with alcohol to dull the worst of the symptoms. Despite this, William was oddly effective. His reign was short but consequential. He oversaw the passing of the Reform Act of 1832, navigated the changing tides of early constitutional monarchy, and managed to outlive most expectations. But his public image was marked by instability, mood swings, short tempers, and physical frailty that made him a subject of quiet concern among ministers. By the final years of his life, William was essentially dependent on daily doses of opiate tinctures. His legs were swollen, his breathing labored, and his appetite erratic. Doctors continued to treat him in the only way they knew how, by sedating him into compliance. It worked, in a grim sort of way. He fulfilled his duties. He showed up when absolutely necessary, and when he couldn't, the excuse was always indisposition, the polite royal euphemism for a man too heavily drugged to stand. He died in 1837, passing the crown to his niece, Queen Victoria, who would reign longer and far more visibly. But the medical inheritance he left behind, the mixing of royal duty with private sedation, would endure. And it had already begun generations earlier, in the body of a man who ruled 2 kingdoms, limped through his days in agony, and used opiates not just to ease his joints, but to keep his mind from imploding. King James I, the first monarch of a unified Britain, ruled with a sharp intellect and a heavily dosed body. 25. King James VI of Scotland. King James III of England, who also reigned as James VI of Scotland, was many things: scholar king, political strategist, religious obsessive, reluctant warrior, and nervous hypochondriac. He was the first monarch of a unified Britain, but also one of its most fragile. both physically and psychologically. His reign was marked by theological debates, court intrigues, and a perpetual fear of assassination. But beneath the crown sat a man in almost constant discomfort, racked by arthritis, plagued by gout, and afflicted with an array of ailments that modern historians suspect may have included colitis, migraines, and a potent case of inherited anxiety. Naturally, he found relief in the pharmacy of his time, which meant one thing: opium-based treatments. James was not a man known for physical vigor. Even in youth, he suffered from stiffness in his joints, muscle spasms, and what his doctors delicately described as internal humors. The reality was likely far more painful. His gait was awkward, his limbs often seized. He experienced prolonged bouts of what today might be diagnosed as inflammatory arthritis. He loathed the cold. He wrapped himself in layers of velvet and fur, not out of vanity, but because his bones ached in the chill. And as his body deteriorated, the royal physicians, well versed in the comforting fog of medicinal narcotics, responded with a cocktail of opiates, herbal sedatives, and alcohol-infused tinctures. Among these, laudanum was the star. Prescribed for joint pain, abdominal cramps, and spasms of melancholy, it became a regular fixture in James's court. So regular, in fact, that records show prescriptions for strong syrup, accompanying him on royal progresses and diplomatic visits. James had a complicated relationship with medicine. On the one hand, he was a devout Christian and a man of letters who believed in the divine order of the body and soul. On the other, he was deeply suspicious of physicians and alternated between overconfidence in their remedies and paranoid distrust. Still, the one thing he never seemed to argue with was the effect of a good, strong dose of poppy-based relief. His personal writings, especially his letters to confidants, frequently refer to his belly trouble and stabbing stiffness. And behind those references lies a life structured around medical management. Before meetings, he often required a dose. Before travel, another. After long audiences, a sleeping draught. Though James fancied himself a philosopher king, he was also a man shackled to routine pain, and inevitably to the drugs that dulled it. His dependency was not theatrical, not dramatic. It was mundane, quiet, embedded in the fabric of daily royal life. But the consequences still showed. His moods could be unpredictable. His energy waxed and waned sharply. Some days he appeared almost animated. Others, he slurred his speech or retired early, citing his ailments. Diplomats noted it. Courtiers whispered about it. But no one dared speak openly of addiction in a reigning king. James died in 1625 at the age of 58, his body swollen, stiff, and heavily medicated. His legacy was political union, the King James Bible, and a lineage that would shake the very foundations of British monarchy. Among his heirs was one king who shared his ailments but wielded none of his caution, Henry VIII, who used opiates not to ponder philosophy, but to fight off the pain of a body he had turned into his own battlefield. 26. Henry VIII is remembered for many things: 6 wives, broken monasteries, a battered church, and a swollen, volatile ego that seemed to expand in tandem with his waistline. But beneath the larger-than-life mythology of the king who redefined monarchy lies a far less triumphant figure, a man besieged by crippling chronic pain, locked inside a decaying body, and slowly numbed by a growing reliance on opium-based painkillers. In his youth, Henry had been athletic, charismatic, even graceful. But decades of jousting, hunting accidents, overeating, and untreated infections took a brutal toll. By his late 40s, he was suffering from severe leg ulcers, gout, arthritis, and what modern historians suspect were long-term circulatory disorders that left his lower limbs chronically inflamed and prone to necrosis. He couldn't walk unaided. He could barely ride. The once vibrant king became sedentary, swollen, and dangerously irritable. And with that shift came the arrival of the Tudor medicine chest. Henry's physicians, men like Dr. Butts and Dr. Wendy, worked tirelessly to manage their royal patients' suffering. The record of their treatments reads like a medieval pain catalog: herbal poultices, leeching, cauterization, and an ever-present rotation of sleeping draughts and syrups laced with opium. These preparations weren't experimental. They were routine. Pain management in Tudor medicine was inseparable from narcotics, and for a man in near-constant agony, sedation was considered both a mercy and a necessity. The descriptions of Henry's condition during his final decade are harrowing. His ulcerated legs emitted a fetid smell, as court accounts delicately put it, and he spent much of his day seated, propped up with cushions, wearing custom garments to accommodate swelling. Movement caused excruciating pain. Standing for long periods was nearly impossible, and yet he was still king, expected to rule, receive envoys, sign documents, and project power. The opium helped make that possible. Administered in varying forms, tinctures, powders, infused wines, the drugs dulled his agony enough to allow for appearances. But they also altered his mood, his clarity, and his famously volatile temper. Courtiers walked on eggshells. Decisions were unpredictable. Some days he was lucid and philosophical, other days impatient, drowsy, or suddenly cruel. The man who once composed love songs and penned theological rebuttals could now barely remain upright without assistance. Modern historians debate whether Henry VIII developed a full chemical dependency, or whether his usage remained within the medical norms of his time. But that question misses the point. Whether formally addicted or not, Henry's final years were shaped, physically and politically, by the haze of opiate sedation. His decisions were made through a fog of discomfort and pharmacology. His body had betrayed him, and in return he entrusted his kingship to anything that would help him feel even a fraction of himself. When he died in 1547, he was nearly unrecognizable, massive, immobile, and heavily drugged. The legend of Henry the Tyrant overshadowed the quiet truth of Henry the Patient. A monarch slowly undone not just by ambition or sin, but by pain. And his pain had a precedent. A king who ruled nearly a century later, twisted by scoliosis and battlefield trauma, would also reach for narcotics, not out of indulgence, but because Richard III had a spine bent by more than just politics. 27. Richard III. Few English monarchs have been more vilified or more misunderstood than Richard III, immortalized by Shakespeare. As a deformed villain with a crown and a conscience made of daggers, the real Richard was a far more complex and human figure. A capable commander, a legal reformer, a patron of the North, and a man living with chronic, debilitating scoliosis that twisted not only his spine, but the entire narrative of his reign. Thanks to the 2012 discovery of Richard's remains beneath a Leicester car park, modern science has given us a clearer picture of his body than most kings in history. The forensic evidence confirmed severe adolescent-onset scoliosis, a condition that curved his spine in an S shape and likely caused constant muscular strain, nerve pain, and reduced lung capacity. It wouldn't have rendered him a hunchbacked monster, as Tudor propaganda suggested, but it would have made standing in armor for hours, riding into battle, and leading troops on campaign an excruciating ordeal. And where there's pain, especially royal pain, there's opium. In the 15th century, opium was not widely standardized, but it was known and used, particularly by royal physicians who maintained close ties with apothecaries, monks, and foreign medical traditions. It was typically administered as poppy syrup, sleeping wine, or in crude pill form, sometimes mixed with honey or wine to dull the bitterness. For a man like Richard, military leader, political strategist, and battlefield king, these remedies would have been both accessible and, in all likelihood, essential. Though direct documentation of Richard's drug use is scarce, unsurprising given the secrecy of medieval medicine, indirect evidence paints a suggestive picture. Chronic back pain in the 15th century was often treated with poppy derivatives, herbal relaxants, and rudimentary sedatives. Descriptions of Richard during his 2-year reign note periods of irritability, insomnia, and mood swings, all consistent with either unmanaged pain or fluctuating responses to strong medication. Moreover, his grueling schedule, riding across the kingdom to secure alliances, enforcing legal reforms, overseeing executions, and preparing for war, would have demanded a way to endure constant physical strain. Scoliosis doesn't get better with stress. It gets worse. And the rigors of kingship, particularly one as embattled as Richard's, only would have exacerbated it. It's not hard to imagine the daily rituals: a morning tonic to help him dress and function, a midday draft before meetings, a stronger dose before sleep. Not for indulgence, but for movement. Not for bliss, but for survival. He died in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, cut down at 32 in the mud and chaos of civil war. Contemporary accounts note that he fought bravely, violently even, charging directly at Henry Tudor in a last attempt to crush rebellion with sheer force. Whether or not he rode into that battle sedated is unknown. But by then, his body had already endured decades of struggle, his back bent under the weight of both his condition and his crown. After his death, Richard's enemies turned his deformity into a symbol of moral corruption. But the truth is far more tragic. He wasn't a monster, he was a monarch in pain. And the woman who would reign just over a century later, Queen Anne, would find herself in the same cycle, trapped in a failing body, strung between childbearing agony and statecraft, and kept standing by ever stronger drafts of laudanum. 28. Queen Anne. Queen Anne reigned over the unification of England and Scotland, steered her country through the War of the Spanish Succession, and helped shape the early contours of the modern British state. But behind the throne, behind the war cabinets and parliamentary acts, was a woman quietly dissolving beneath the weight of chronic illness, unbearable grief, and a body racked by pain. Hers was a reign built on strength, but propped up by laudanum. Anne's health troubles began early and never let up. She suffered from gout, dropsy, edema, migraines, and a slew of what physicians vaguely termed nervous disorders. Her joints swelled, her legs ached. Walking became nearly impossible in her later years. Worse still was the emotional toll. She experienced 17 pregnancies, 7 miscarriages, 5 stillbirths, and 5 children who died young. Only one son, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy, and he too died at age 11. The physical and emotional trauma of this repeated loss was profound and inescapable. Doctors, ever faithful to the pharmacopoeia of the age, treated her with the one tool they understood best: opium, most often in the form of laudanum. It was given to her for menstrual pain, for the inflammation in her legs, for her insomnia, and, though never acknowledged outright, for the psychological anguish that defined much of her adult life. By the time she ascended the throne in 1702, Anne was already reliant on narcotic sedation to function. And yet, function she did. For 12 years, she ruled a fractious kingdom at a pivotal moment in its history. She navigated the rise of party politics, mediated between Whigs and Tories, appointed and dismissed ministers, and regularly attended council meetings, even when she could barely walk. On bad days, she was carried in a sedan chair. On worse days, she remained in bed, issuing orders through a haze of painkillers and pillows. Laudanum had become part of her daily life. Physicians like Sir David Hamilton and others within her court prescribed it routinely, adjusting dosages as her condition worsened. It wasn't abuse in the modern sense. It was maintenance, royal necessity. The invisible infrastructure of power was not just titles and bureaucracy. It was a bottle on the nightstand, a carefully timed drop before a council session, a stronger mixture before sleep. Anne's correspondence in her later years is telling. Sentences trail off. Thoughts repeat. There's a mental fog that creeps into her letters, even as she tries to remain engaged. Meanwhile, accounts from her attendants and courtiers describe a woman in near constant discomfort, withdrawn, unpredictable, sometimes blank with fatigue, yet still determined to fulfill her role. By the final years of her reign, Anne was physically and emotionally spent. Her swelling had worsened to the point that her clothing had to be custom adapted, and her mobility was almost entirely gone. The drugs were no longer just a tool. They were a lifeline. She was kept in motion by medicine, and that motion defined an era. She died in 1714 in Kensington Palace, surrounded not by heirs, but by physicians, ministers, and the silent weight of unspoken pain. The union she had helped forge outlived her. But the cost was measured not just in policy or legacy, but in ounces of laudanum, quietly administered behind the curtains. And centuries earlier, Mary, Queen of Scots, had already followed that path, seeking solace from her own political captivity and relentless migraines in the dark glass bottles of opium her apothecaries brought to the Tower. 29. Mary, Queen of Scots. In the long blood-stained ledger of British royalty, Mary, Queen of Scots occupies a space both revered and tragic. Romanticized as the beautiful Catholic martyr undone by betrayal, power games, and English paranoia, Mary lived a life that was anything but soft. She was crowned queen when she was 6 days old. She was widowed before 20. She married disastrously, twice, and spent nearly 2 decades as a political prisoner in a foreign kingdom. But through it all, her most consistent companion wasn't a courtier or confidant. It was a small bottle brought to her by her physicians, filled with the opium-based remedies used to quiet the pain in her head and in her fate. Mary suffered from severe recurring migraines, a condition well documented in letters between her and her advisors, as well as in the accounts of the apothecaries and attendants who shadowed her through every royal prison and temporary refuge. These were not mild headaches. They were days-long episodes of blinding pain, nausea, sensitivity to sound and light, and complete incapacitation. In the 16th century, this condition was understood only vaguely, often blamed on vapors or imbalanced humors. The treatments? Poppy-based tinctures, oil-soaked compresses, and opiates disguised in honey or wine. By the time she was in her 20s, after the death of her first husband, Francis II of France, and her catastrophic marriage to Lord Darnley, Mary was already relying regularly on opium preparations for relief. These weren't recreational indulgences, they were administered out of necessity. She needed to function, to lead, to write, to negotiate, to survive. And survival, for Mary, was a full-time occupation. After her forced abdication and flight to England in 1568, things only worsened. She became Elizabeth I's most prestigious prisoner, shuffled from castle to castle under the guise of hospitality, always under watch, always being handled like a diplomatic landmine. The isolation, the stress of imprisonment, and her declining physical health compounded her migraine condition. Letters from this period mention bouts of chronic insomnia, back pain, and dark spells, all of which were treated with increasing doses of narcotic remedies. Her apothecaries, loyal even in exile, prepared opium mixtures, herbal sedatives, and distilled cordials to ease her suffering. She took them regularly, particularly during the winter months when the damp aggravated her joints and intensified her headaches. She also used these remedies to sleep, especially during periods of diplomatic tension when news of plots, betrayals, and looming interrogations left her restless. The opiates provided brief shelter from her surroundings, a few hours of control in a life that had lost all of it. Yet she remained intellectually sharp, politically engaged, and fiercely proud. She never relinquished her claim to the English throne. She continued writing letters in code, smuggling correspondence past her captors, and crafting political strategies with every flickering candle left in her chambers. But behind those efforts was a woman in constant pain, physical, emotional, historical. Her laudanum was not weakness, it was armor. Mary was executed in 1587 after nearly 19 years in captivity. Her death was theatrical, designed to feel just, but her life had been an endurance test cloaked in velvet and shadow. She died standing, but she lived heavily medicated, and a century later, Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch, would take the same chemical path, not out of pain, but out of pleasure, curiosity, and a court so soaked in indulgence that even the king's medicine cabinet looked like a banquet. 30. Charles II, the Merry Monarch. If Mary, Queen of Scots, turned to opium in grief and captivity, Charles II did so in celebration. His reign, following the collapse of the puritanical Commonwealth, marked England's great swing from severity to spectacle. Gone were the gritted teeth of Cromwell's England. In came the wigs, the wine, the mistresses, and the endless appetite for sensory novelty. Charles II wasn't just a king, he was a party in human form. And like every good party, his court had a drug cabinet. Charles was no stranger to exotic remedies, both in theory and practice. An enthusiastic patron of science, medicine, and experimentation, he surrounded himself with alchemists, astrologers, and physicians who blurred the lines between cure and curiosity. He chartered the Royal Society, encouraged anatomical studies, and kept his personal physicians busy not only with prescriptions, but with research. Among the many substances Charles explored were opium tinctures, specifically laudanum, and other narcotic-infused concoctions sold under grandiose names like elixir of life, the king's cordial, or syrup of poppies. These were not just medical tools but fashionable commodities, often imported or mixed in the apothecaries of London with spices from the East, sugar from the colonies, and opium harvested far beyond the reach of Parliament. His health, ironically, wasn't especially poor, at least not until the final decade of his life. But Charles took medicines anyway, sometimes for real ailments, gout, indigestion, chronic headaches, sometimes for more ambiguous ones, melancholy, night terrors, and the agitation of the spleen, and sometimes just to experience the effects. Laudanum dulled his pain, other tinctures perked him up. Some of his favored preparations combined opium, alcohol, and exotic resins into heady syrups that were part remedy, part ritual. This wasn't considered deviant. In fact, Charles's use of such substances was perfectly in line with Restoration culture, where performance, sensation, and excess were part of royal branding. He was the Merry Monarch, after all, and a merry monarch needed remedies as lively as his court. But by the 1670s, his lifestyle began to catch up with him. Years of overindulgence took a toll. He began to suffer from frequent digestive problems, painful leg swelling, and intermittent fever, all of which were treated with increasingly heavy narcotics. Court records show prescriptions for opiates becoming more frequent, paired with bloodletting and bizarre chemical tonics that included gold dust, pearl powder, and beaver gland extract. When the traditional remedies failed, doctors reached for the strongest available sedatives, which meant opium, and a lot of it. By the time of his death in 1685, Charles was being administered a cocktail of nearly 60 substances in his final days, among them laudanum, purgatives, and vaporous elixirs designed to stimulate his humors. His last words, spoken in groggy resignation, were, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a troublesome patient." Even in death, he performed. But the next king, Charles I, his father, had a relationship with opium that was far less celebratory. His world was not gilded and witty, but crumbling and blood-stained. His prescriptions weren't for pleasure. They were for a kingdom falling apart and a body trying to endure it. 31. Charles I. If Charles II danced through life with a tonic in one hand and a mistress in the other, his father, Charles I, spent his reign trying to hold a kingdom together with trembling fingers, and the occasional opium-laced remedy prescribed to stop them from shaking. Reserved, devout, and deeply committed to the divine right of kings, Charles I ruled with a stubborn intensity that made civil war all but inevitable. He believed monarchy was sacred. Unfortunately, the people no longer did. And as the pressure mounted, internally and externally, he turned quietly, almost predictably, to opium-based medicine to keep functioning. Charles wasn't a physically frail man in the beginning. He was shy, soft-spoken, prone to stammers, but otherwise capable and resilient. What broke him wasn't illness. It was the grind of a nation slowly rejecting everything he believed in. The 1630s and 1640s were years of endless strain. Religious schisms, parliamentary revolts, puritanical fury, court betrayals, and the slow collapse of royal authority. He watched the machinery of his rule disassemble in real time, with little he could do but issue decrees that no longer carried weight. And through it all, the court physicians kept prescribing. Laudanum, derived from opium and alcohol, was by then a standard treatment for a wide range of complaints: insomnia, headaches, melancholy, digestive trouble, and what 17th century doctors referred to as distempers of the mind. Charles's symptoms, though never publicly described in detail, were enough to merit frequent dosing. During the most turbulent years of his reign, especially the years of personal rule without Parliament, 1629 to 1640, he reportedly suffered from migraines, chronic fatigue, and periodic chest discomfort. His physicians responded with what they knew: opiate tinctures infused with herbs and carefully portioned to soften the stress. These remedies weren't scandalous, they were quiet, necessary. Courtiers referred to them in passing: His Majesty's evening draught, the cordial for rest, the royal tincture. These polite euphemisms masked what was becoming increasingly common among the aristocracy: chemical endurance. Charles, in private, would take these medicines before negotiations, before sleepless nights, and sometimes before making the kinds of irreversible decisions that history would later dissect with cold precision. The most pivotal moments of his reign, the build-up to war, the execution of his allies, the surrender at Oxford, were likely endured under the veil of opiates. Not because he wanted to numb himself emotionally, he was notoriously principled, but because his body could no longer take the full, unfiltered weight of the crown collapsing. Even in captivity, after his defeat in the English Civil War, Charles continued receiving medicinal aid. While imprisoned at Carisbrooke Castle, his keepers recorded instances of him being attended with remedies, including soporifics and comforting tonics typical of laudanum-based sedatives. His letters from this time reveal a man calm but weary, lucid but subdued, perhaps from faith, perhaps from fatigue, or perhaps from carefully measured doses of forgetfulness. He was executed in 1649, stoic to the end. But the body that climbed the scaffold had been medicated through years of collapse, treated not for sickness but for strain. Strain that no king, divine or otherwise, was built to withstand unaided. And long before Charles, one royal child knew what it was to be dosed not as a ruler, but as a symbol. Edward VI, the boy king, received opium not for pain he understood, but for the pain others were trying to keep out of sight. 32. King Edward VI. Edward VI, the long-awaited male heir of Henry VIII, ascended to the throne at just 9 years old and died before reaching 16. A boy king whose reign lasted only 6 years, Edward was less a ruler and more a vessel, anointed in ink, doctrine, and expectation. Protestant reformers saw in him the perfect monarch, malleable, educated, godly, and too young to resist. But beneath the weight of Reformation politics and courtly control was a child who was sick more often than he was not, and managed, from a disturbingly young age, with the standard medical regime of his time: opium, syrups of poppies, and a rotating schedule of what his physicians referred to as sleeping drafts. From the earliest years of his life, Edward was protected obsessively. He was raised in an almost clinical environment, nursed by carefully vetted women, kept at a distance from the common cold, and monitored by an entourage of tutors, guards, and doctors. Despite this, he was chronically unwell. He suffered from periodic fevers, headaches, and what was often described as weakness in the chest. Medical records from his upbringing mention night sweats, loss of appetite, and general malaise that would come and go in waves. By the time he took the throne in 1547, Edward's life was fully structured around his body's limits, and those limits were carefully padded by his physicians, who dosed him with opiate-based tinctures for nearly every ailment. Poppy syrup was administered for coughs. Laudanum, by then commonly prescribed in noble circles, was used to ease his sleeplessness. When he complained of a tightness in the chest or pressure of the head, he was given herbal decoctions laced with narcotics, meant to keep him calm and manageable. It's important to remember, Edward was not in control. His Regency Council, dominated by the Duke of Somerset and later the Duke of Northumberland, ruled in his name. His body, like his signature, was simply another royal instrument. And when that body began to fail in earnest, likely from tuberculosis, though some suggest other infections, he was treated with increasing urgency and desperation. As his condition worsened in 1553, his medications grew more aggressive. The court's top physicians began layering opium with purgatives, calming tonics, and exotic concoctions imported at great cost. He was wasting away. He knew it. So did they. His final weeks were marked by extreme pain, shortness of breath, and hallucinations. He was dosed almost constantly, not to cure him, but to allow him to endure. Courtiers whispered about his ghostly appearance. His tutors stopped assigning lessons. His voice, once described as steady and bright, turned hoarse and thin. He died that July, at the age of 15, leaving behind a country in religious chaos and a precedent that few were eager to discuss. The royal body, from infancy to death, shaped and sustained by narcotics. And the body that followed, decades later, belonged to a queen who had no crown, no throne, and no formal power, but Elizabeth. The Queen Mother knew exactly how the royal system worked. She'd seen it hollow out a husband, and when grief came for her, she reached for the same solution hidden in the drawers of every royal bedroom. 33. Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother. In public, Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother was the embodiment of smiling resilience, always poised, always gracious, always dressed in pastel armor and pearls. She walked through bombed-out London during the Blitz. She stood by her husband's side as he struggled through wartime speeches, and for half a century she played the part of the nation's grandmother, warm, witty, untouched by scandal. But behind the royal charm offensive was a woman whose life, especially in later years, was carefully held together by sedatives, sleeping pills, and the same quiet pharmacological coping mechanisms that had supported royals before her. Her introduction to pharmaceuticals came not through vice, but through necessity, emotional, physical, and circumstantial. In the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s, her husband, King George VI, suffered from a growing list of health problems: lung disease, ulcers, and eventually cancer. She watched him suffer silently, doped with morphine and barbiturates, propped up by doctors who never spoke plainly. The pressure of wartime, coupled with the weight of royal expectation, didn't leave much room for private collapse. So she didn't collapse. She coped. And coping meant prescription medication. Elizabeth was known to experience chronic insomnia, particularly after her husband's death in 1952. Palace insiders referred to her troubled nights, difficult recoveries, and a delicate nervous constitution. She was prescribed a regimen of barbiturate-based sleeping pills, which were common among upper-class women in the mid-20th century. part of a growing post-war culture of quiet medicalized containment. Unlike earlier royal drug users, Elizabeth's routine wasn't shrouded in euphemism. It was structured. Her medications were prescribed, scheduled, and adjusted by physicians in consultation with palace staff. She had difficulty sleeping in unfamiliar places. She often requested her evening preparation before long public engagements. There were whispered jokes among staff about Mummy's medicine, spoken with affection, never cruelty. As she aged, the prescriptions changed. By the 1960s and 70s, benzodiazepines had replaced older barbiturates. She transitioned into a new generation of tranquilizers, milder, more socially acceptable, but no less habit-forming. Friends and biographers noted her increasing reliance on these medications not just for sleep, but for emotional regulation. She had outlived her husband, her political era, and eventually, her second daughter, Margaret. The grief was immense. The royal family did what it always did in such times. It stood still, smiled, and dosed accordingly. Even in her final decades, Elizabeth remained highly visible. She attended engagements well into her 90s, but those close to her knew she never traveled without a personal doctor. Her public persona was warm and indestructible. Her private one, carefully managed. Medicated into grace. She died in 2002, just a few months after Princess Margaret, quietly, peacefully, surrounded by flowers, photographs, and, one assumes, the same discreet bottle in the nightstand drawer. The monarchy rolled on, as it always does. But behind its polished surface is a long, unspoken history of royal bodies propped up by chemistry, of pain transformed into protocol, of grief turned into dosage, and of 33 names, quietly connected, not by scandal, but by the same small bitter drop,